She's taking care of it. How's this? What about now? So. Okay, I will try my best to be nice and loud. Does it go up at all, Ben?
You just have to hold on.
Okay, all right, here we go. We're going to double hold it. There we go. We're going to do this. That works?
Yes.
Yes, that's better? Okay, thank you guys so much. So, as I was saying, this fourth-year course on obesity really changed my perspective on a lot of things, and in one particular area that I became absolutely fascinated with is appetite. And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you guys about it today. And that's why the title of my talk is The Complexity of Human Appetite Regulation, Why Just Eat Less is Terrible Advice. So do you guys agree with that statement? That just eat less is absolutely terrible advice. And we're going to build into why it is terrible, but part of it is that it fails to account for the complexity of appetite regulation. So when I was building this talk, I started to think a little bit about where my earlier issues in and around appetite started, and I remembered being 10 years old and at my godparents' house, and they had all this wonderful food, and in particular they had my favorite food, which is a lot of our favorite food, which is pizza. And I remember, it's so strange that this is such a traumatic moment for me, because I remember my parents knew I had issues with obesity, my godparents knew I had issues with obesity, and I felt their pressure about that very much so at that time. But there was also pizza. And I couldn't stop eating it. And I remember in my 10-year-old brain thinking, why can't I just stop eating? And my parents just said, well, just stop eating when you're full. And I was like, why can't I feel full? I don't know if any of you guys ever agree with this feeling, yeah. And so that led me to a path of trying to understand appetite a little bit more. Well, that wasn't just the only thing, but that was my earliest experience with appetite. But that kind of sparked part of my interest in the human body and eventually led me to teach courses on obesity, which was really exciting. And one of the things I learned when teaching my 417 class is that I'm not the only one that is a bit confused about appetite. So I want to ask you guys a question to start off. So I want you to take 30 seconds, I'll time it with my watch, and I want you guys to reflect personally on these two questions. Number one, what does appetite feel like? What does it feel like? Where is it coming from? And number two, how do you know when you're full? Where's that feeling coming from?
The brain.
Okay, so you say the brain, and what does it feel like in your brain?
Well, the signal comes from your brain.
The
right?
signal comes from the brain.
For both things.
For both things. For wanting to eat and feeling full.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a different answer? Yeah?
I feel like, for me, I feel a difference between hunger, which is a very physical sensation, and appetite, which is desire. Because I can be physically hungry and not want to eat when I have low appetite.
Absolutely. So that's an important differentiation you made there. Hunger versus appetite. Hunger is the I need to eat. My stomach is growling. It is the physiological drive to consume. Whereas appetite is basically the overall drive to consume that can be influenced by hunger as well. Anyone else have a different answer for appetite? Yeah?
When I see it. And I just know it's going to be good if it's something.
So you know it's going to be good. So she said, when I see it, I know it's going to be good. So is that here? Is that here? It's up here. Okay, so let's see what what about actually the second question? How do you know when you're full?
When this is satiated.
So when this feels,
This is satiated.
that's satiated, okay? So this feels full. Anyone else? I already got you, yeah?
For me, it was appetite is here, but how do I know when I'm full? That's tummy.
Okay, so appetite, brain, fullness, tummy. Yes? Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, well let's see what my fourth year students had to say to this question. So what does your appetite feel like? I got a number of different responses, but one of the answers was usually from an odd sensation in my stomach. Okay? The other one I got, and this one actually hits home a little bit too much, a desire to feel a different emotion. Yes. Like something doesn't feel right, I need to get something else perhaps. And then like an urge or mental block that needs to be fulfilled, coming from my brain, not my stomach. Yes? Agree? Disagree? Which one? A, B, or C?
Yeah, B or C.
So who says A? B? C? Oh, you guys are great at helping me prove my point here. Thank you guys so much. Okay, let's look at the second question. How do you know when you are full? Sometimes I don't know I am full until I feel completely uncomfortable in my abdomen. Yeah? Food no longer has the same appeal. And C, I'm full when I finish my plate. So keep in mind, I think it's worth mentioning, these are fourth-year biomedical physiology and kinesiology students. You know, of my population, very few of them deal with obesity. And so my point is that it's not just something that is confusing to a certain population. It's not something that's clear to everyone. So I don't know if you can figure out my main message. Actually, sorry, let me ask again. So who agrees with A here? Who feels more A? B? Any B's in the room? C? I'm a C'er myself, very much so. So does anyone know what my main message here is? So it's different for everyone? And it's complex. So when I say complex, what I mean is that something is different for everyone. We would say it's heterogeneous. Everyone has a different experience with it. Another element of complexity is something changes over time. It's not always the same. Also, another thing with complexity is one thing can lead to the other and lead back to itself. So for instance, stress can promote appetite, and appetite can promote some stress as well. So appetite is not as simple as a lot of us make it out to be. So this is really something that I hope to communicate to you guys here, is some of the complexity of this very not clear concept. So in today's presentation, what I would like to do is to give you an overview of the basics. There's so much, it was really hard to make this talk, and bring it down just to some key points and not bore you too much. I'm going to give you an overview. I also hate going to talks where I have nothing tangible to leave with. I don't know if any of you guys feel that way, but I'm like, give me something. Yeah, tell me it's complex, sure, but what can I do about that? So I have 20 strategies to offer to you, and what I really want to stress with this is that everyone is different, and that there is no single set of strategies that work for everyone. And it's about tailor-making your own plan when it comes to all your weight-related behaviors or just your lifestyle behaviors. So pick and choose. It's not like you have to do all of these. Maybe only one of them is relevant to you, or maybe you make up your own as we go, okay? And then the last thing, let's have a good time. Okay, so that is always part of my goal here, okay? Before I begin, I do have to say one thing though. This is a topic that I think a lot of obesity and appetite is a topic that has a lot of, well, weight to it. And a lot of us, when we hear about these topics, including myself, we might play the shame and the guilt game a little bit. And I really want to encourage you guys to not use any judgments for yourself or anyone else as we go through this. This is not about judgment, this is about understanding. So ideally, we can replace some judgment with curiosity. Okay, so instead of, why do I eat like this? Why do I eat like this? I wonder why that is. I wonder why I have issues with this. I wonder where it started. I wonder where the signal's coming from. So instead of these judgmental thoughts that can often lead to some other negative behaviors, let's replace this with curiosity, like a child. Okay, so here we go. So any talk on the complexity of obesity would be missing something if it didn't include this slide. Yes, right? We've all seen this slide before, yes? So this is the Foresight map. It came out in 2007, and this is from a UK group called the Foresight Group that came together and was like, let's figure out all the causes of obesity. And its main goal is to show the complexity of obesity. If you want to have fun, you can pick and choose between each of these categories and try to see all the evidence-based reasons and causes that can lead to obesity. I make my fourth-year students do this, actually. But the main message here is just complexity. So I am going to be talking about a very narrow part of this map. And I'm not even really going to use this map. This is really just to show you the concept of complexity, okay? So we're not talking about physical activity, we're not talking about psychology, we're not talking about the food industry, although they have their role in this as well. I really just want to focus down into appetite. The Foresight map does that. They focus into appetite a little bit. I didn't really like their appetite map, so I made my own. Okay? So this is my appetite map that's going to guide our presentation today. And don't worry, there will not be a quiz on this at the end. But this was really me just like, okay, how am I going to talk about this? How am I going to take this massive topic and bring it down into palatable chunks? Okay? So I'm going to start talking a little bit about how our fat cells influence our appetite. Of course, our GI tract, including the bacteria in our digestive tract, in our colon, can influence our appetite as well. But as you probably are aware, reward and the environment, those have a big say on appetite too. Okay? But you'll notice what everything is kind of feeding into is this little hub right here. What's the H stand for? Anyone know? Hypothalamus, excellent. So hypothalamus, that's your drive center. That's the like, I need, I want to get. Okay, so that's where your thirst center is. That's where your sex drive comes from as well. Part of it comes from there. And this is kind of the hot spot of where appetite is located. Okay, so I am going to get to this. However, I can't have a talk about appetite and appetite regulation and not talk a little bit about genetics. Okay, so I just want to layer this at the base so we understand that this is also playing a role. Okay? So any talk about genetics and obesity also always includes this slide. I don't know if you've ever seen this slide before. Okay, so these are in some 1986 studies on the correlation in body weight, or BMI, between monozygotic twins versus dizygotic twins. So identical twins versus fraternal twins. So remember, identical twins share the exact same DNA. Okay, their genome is the same, whereas the fraternal twins are going to have a different set of genetic makeup. And you'll notice that these numbers are actually what is the main take-home message here. Between identical twins, even if they're raised apart, between identical twins, body mass index seems to correlate very strongly, especially at older ages. So these are some of the earliest studies to show that there is a correlation between genetics and obesity. One of my favorite other studies about genetics and obesity is the famous Laval overfeeding studies, which just sound kind of fun. So basically what they did at Laval University in Quebec City, they took these men, 12 pairs of identical twins, and they housed them at the university and they overfed them for 100 days. Okay? And they found out how much they ate baseline, and then they added 1,000 calories to their baseline consumption. And they wanted to see what was the change in body mass, but also in fat in those identical twins. Okay? So this might be a little bit hard to read, but let me just bring you through this. On the x-axis, we basically see one twin and the amount of gain in belly fat, basically. Okay, so one twin versus the other twin. And the important line here is this middle line. And this middle line shows basically that so if I look at this, one twin gained 20 centimeters squared of visceral fat. The other twin gained 22. One twin gained 30. The other twin gained 20. That one's not as correlated. But if I look at this, one twin gained 30. The other twin gained about 30 as well. So the correlation between, so what one twin gained was almost very close to what another twin gained. And what's actually more interesting about this, they were all overfed by 1,000 calories. So if it's as simple as energy in versus energy out, you would expect them all to gain exactly the same amount of body fat, right? But what we actually see is there's a lot of variability in how much weight these twins gained. Okay, so this shows the similarities between twin 1 and twin 2, but you see a lot of differences in overall amounts of fat gained. Okay, so this is another piece of evidence to show that genetics is playing a role in the gain of body fat and the change in body mass index. But we've become a bit more sophisticated these days in our genetic analyses. And there's a really cool type of study going on these days called genome-wide association studies. Sounds interesting. So what they now have is all this genome data. So I know your genetic code. Okay, I know yours, I know yours, I know yours, I know yours. And I have all this data, DNA data from around the world. So I have all this information. Now let's see what it tells me. And what they basically did is they looked at the genomes of individuals with obesity and compared it to the genomes of individuals without obesity. And they found in the individuals with obesity, there seemed to be the same changes in the DNA code that were really predictable. And they found, this is an intimidating slide, they found 97 loci, places in the genetic code that seemed to be changed and conserved amongst individuals with obesity. And what they expected was that these genetic changes would all be localized around metabolic regions, that they would be genes that would be expressed in metabolic regions. And what they found is that the majority of the genetic changes that they found in individuals that were conserved in individuals with obesity occurred in and around appetite centers. And they still don't understand it all, because as you'll see right now, each of these little genetic changes has very little effect on their own. But when you add them all up, and we're still trying to understand, well, this isn't clear, we just know there's a change. We don't know necessarily what it does. We haven't even, sometimes it's not even at the specific place where the gene codes for something. But we do see these genetic changes, and it does give more support to the fact that there is a relationship between appetite changes and increased risk of obesity. Okay? So that's not it when it comes to genetics, though. I don't know if you guys have heard of the, oh, sorry, I forgot about this slide. Sorry about that. So the question is, can we do anything about genetics? No. Okay? So I want to say this, I want to have this talk about genetics because I want people to realize that it does make a difference. But I actually don't like focusing on things that we can't control, that we can't change. I think it's important to understand that this does make it more difficult for some people, okay? But we do have a lot of influence with our behaviors, okay? But it is harder for some people. Just like school is harder for some people than others. Just like relationships are harder for some people than others. You know, and we all kind of have to deal with some things that are a bit more difficult than for other individuals. Okay? So, but I'm going to offer strategies. Okay? So, have you guys heard of epigenetics? Anyone familiar with this term? So, epigenetics is another really interesting emerging field, and it doesn't look at how the genome changes. So, DNA is the same. Okay? DNA is absolutely the same, but what epigenetics looks at is how little markers or changes to how DNA is kind of coiled up, or if there's little like tags, these little like, they're called methyl groups, that sometimes attach to DNA, it can affect if that DNA actually does anything or not, okay? So why is there a pregnant woman here? Anyone know why? Yeah. Yeah, it seems to start, or some of its major origins are in utero, in the uterus, but we're actually learning that it can be passed from generation to generation as well. But what this slide is meant to convey is that what a pregnant mother eats, in particular, but also things like anxiety and other factors, can actually affect not the DNA makeup, not the actual like base codes of DNA, but how likely that DNA is actually going to do something. Okay? So for instance, children that are born to mothers that gain a lot of weight during pregnancy seem to have an increased risk of obesity. And this may be one of the reasons why that is. That being said, please be clear that I am not blaming mothers here. Okay, mothers, we're all just, well, not a mother yet, but eventually, mothers are just trying to do the best they can. you know, and there's been this thing that's been said a long time to women that are pregnant, you are no longer eating for one, you're eating for two. You know, and I haven't been pregnant yet, but I'm sure my cravings are going to be difficult to control when that actually happens. But the point here is that this seems to have a large effect on the likelihood for obesity, and it changes to appetite too. To give you a mouse study that backs this up a little bit, if you try to understand this, so they can actually they can breed these mice in the lab to be basically obese mice. They're what we call OB mice. And these mice, in particular, one type of these mice, tend to be yellow and have the what we call obese phenotype. Okay? What's interesting though is if this mother with obesity has children regularly, they'll all look a lot like her. Okay? Because they'll have the same genetic makeup. When they fed these mice, these pregnant mice with obesity, a diet that was rich in something called methyl groups, it didn't change the DNA of the offspring of the kids, but it like added these little tags to the DNA. And they found that when they added those tags to the DNA, the mice with the most tags to them actually had the least likely to express obesity, and actually had a change in their code as well. So all we did is change the mother's diet. All we did is change the mother's diet, and there was a completely different phenotype evidenced in those offspring. Okay? So again, this is about understanding the physiology of appetite and obesity. But again, I want to see if we can actually make a difference here. Is epigenetics an intervention place? What do you think? Yeah, exactly, good. So for future generations, good answer. You saw I don't know if you saw my slide, but that's really great. So it's, for future generations it is. And that's why there's a big push amongst obstetrics doctors to really focus on healthier pregnancies. All right, that's why we screen for something called gestational diabetes during pregnancy as well. Do you mind if I hold your questions to the end of the talk? Is that okay? Just because I go on tangents really quickly, so I'll give you time for questions at the end, okay? Otherwise, there might be a little bit of change here and there with our epigenetics as we get older, but not enough for this to be a really important intervention point, okay? So again, this isn't about, you know, blaming our genes or feeling defeated. I actually hate whenever I read an article in the news about obesity and genetics, and then you read the comments, and people are like, well, you're just trying to excuse it. You're just trying to, like, you know, give blame somewhere else. And it's not about that. It's about understanding. But it's also not about feeling defeated, because genetics does increase our chances for certain outcomes, but ultimately it's our behaviors and what we do that influence the final product. Okay? But it is harder for some, and there's a genetic basis for this. That's the message. Okay, so now to the main stuff. Okay, so now I want to get into talking a little bit about appetite, and in particular I'll focus on two sides of appetite. So I was trying to think of a better way to say this, but like I called it energy balance appetite. In class I would call it homeostatic appetite. And that's the reason I have a thermostat here, right? So a homeostatic appetite or energy balance appetite, that's the type of appetite that tries to keep you perhaps, as some people would say, at a set point. It's watching what's going on inside, and then your appetite is responding to it. Okay? But as you're probably aware, this appetite has its own super control over our energy intake. And it can definitely reward appetite, or what we call hedonic appetite, can override this other system. And it seems to do so more so in individuals with obesity as well. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about energy balance appetite, and I'll get into some of the main aspects of it. So you already guessed this. I'm happy to see that you know this. A lot of what I'll keep talking about is going to come back to the hypothalamus. Okay? So like I said, the hypothalamus is the drive center, and that's really the